So serious games, games that model serious issues to allow you to explore um, alternative possibilities is a big industry, and it's important, and it's very far removed from the sort of gaming that most people do. I suppose the first serious game goes back to the 1820s in the von Weizsäck's Kriegsspiel, which was adopted by the Prussian General Staff and the Prussian Army through the 19th century as a training tool. And it was originally and usually played double blind with two opposing sets of commanders in different rooms, um, feeding instructions through to the umpires who had the master map and were the only ones that could see everything. So there was a substantial amount of fog of war in there, and it was used not just for military training but for staff training at a point in time when military operations were moving from the single battlefield to the extended space, which, where not everything was visible to the commander in chief. And therefore, staff work, written orders were becoming more important. One of the great arenas of serious military gaming in the 1930s was the US Naval Academy, where prior to World War II, they gamed out almost every possibility for the war in the Pacific, including surprise airborne attacks on Pearl Harbor on a Sunday morning, which they tried out in 1932 as a fleet exercise, and therefore they should have known better. In the 1960s, in the Cold War, a great deal of work was put into not just military but civil military games, because the problem of nuclear escalation and the involvement of the two different types of command and control here, it's the civilian and the military, and the prospect of sudden and rapid escalation, as well as the improvement of communication systems which made it possible for civilian commanders to exercise more influence over the battlefield. That had been going back as far as Lincoln in the American Civil War. One of the problems with that was that a huge amount of energy and effort was put into devising very elaborate computer simulations, and they were badly built. The data was not reusable. And that was a huge problem, which has now meant that, in fact, the US Department of Defense is one of the prime drivers of standardization in data collection for learning games and teaching simulations. Because if they collect a database and build it, they want to be able to reuse it. Moving to the political end of the spectrum, and this also touches on the business end. Decision-making simulations in crisis have become a common tool for planning. In the business side, Royal Dutch Shell pioneered the use of this as a method they call scenario planning, and it has largely converged with, again, the political level of political military simulations, which sometimes is unkindly referred to as BOGSAT, bunch of old guys sat around a table, which it can be, and badly done and poorly structured, it can produce terrible results. And these two images, one is from a tourism course in New Zealand, where the students are actually engaging in a management simulation game, in teams, I guess, where they're given a situation and they're asked what are their options and what will they do. And then based on the choices they make, the game moderator tells them what the results are and advances the game clock and presents them with the next set of options arising because of the choices they made. This is from a game, but it's not a game. It comes under the umbrella of gaming, but it's really a simulation exercise conducted by the US Institute for Peace in 2013 to try and explore pathways to a resolution of the Syrian civil war. So they assembled 45 experts and sat them around a table and started them with the situation as it was and asked them to explore, to game out possible scenarios which might lead to a resolution. And that was an interesting, exercise. Obviously, some problems are intractable and unsolvable, but part of the issue here is, or part of the problem or the interest is trying to identify in both these games, what are the key elements of the problem? What are the things you can model? How do the elements of the system interact with one another? If you change something here, what impact will it have there? And how does that work? So it requires knowing a great deal about a situation, whether it's a business planning simulation or a political military simulation, or a crisis planning exercise, you need to have some grasp of what the situation is. And sometimes, and one of the things the early Cold War games in the United States revealed was that huge chunks of the US government did not have a common vocabulary for speaking to one another during a nuclear conflict. So that revealed a necessity for something that had to be done to fix a problem so that communication in a crisis would work effectively and the decision makers could get together and solve the problem. So um, hopefully I'll get these in the right order. I want to look at a couple of games. There's many you could look at. This is from, I think it's the 1980s, Napoleon at Waterloo. This is a classic board war game, hex and counter board game. And its model of combat is very simple. All of the counters only have two numbers on them. They have, well, that are important. They have the combat value and the movement. They also have a unit designation and a setup hex for convenience. Movement is regulated by the hex grid. There are limitations in this type of game. It's an I go, you go. The French player does their movement and combat, then the Allied player. Both players can see all of the map. You have this omniscient overview of everything, which is not realistic at all. So there are severe limits on its realism as a hobby game. There are also limits on how it models combat. It has a view or a vision of combat, which is simply that it's got to do with fire and movement. And this is very similar to the sort of military history that was being written in the 1970s and 80s, still what John Keegan calls general staff history. Since then, operational hobby war games and professional military games now have much more complex models. And they take into account troop morale and troop quality and cohesion and supply, and all of those other things are now introduced into the model, which can produce a very complex model, more realistic but more complicated, although in some hobby games it's still quite playable. And there are also mechanisms to limit the ability of the player to make command decisions without limitation. So there may be limits on how many units you can activate. Units may have a different activation rating depending on how readily they will actually get up and go and do what you tell them to do, things like this. So the understanding of the face of battle has developed in military historiography, and military simulation games have increased the sophistication of their modeling to match that, as do a great deal of other games. If you think about it, Monopoly is a very simple game and it's incredibly boring. If you were to build a modern contemporary game of property building or, for example, imperial expansion like Puerto Rico, it's more complicated because we now have a more complex understanding of how those problems work. This is a particularly interesting example. Colonial Twilight. It's a strategic level game which models the French-Algerian War in the late 1950s and the early 1960s. So it's about area control, and both the French and the Algerians have different types of resources that they can deploy. But one of the decisions the game designer has made, it's part of a modern set of counterinsurgency games that model a great many late 20th century and 21st century conflicts, is that player actions, first of all, are limited by cards. You draw a hand of cards every turn, and that's the actions you can take. So you might have a brilliant plan, but you're limited by what you've got in your hand, which is a way to model the limitations on what actual commanders could do as distinct from the omniscient player with the benefit of hindsight. The other thing that this game designer has done is that on those cards, the options that are available to the French are only the options which were available in French counterinsurgency doctrine at that point in time. So if you're playing the French in this game and you have a genius plan with the benefit of hindsight as to how you could have won the war in Algeria for the French, well, you can't, because it was not within the intellectual framework of the French military and political command at the time, so you're not within the bounds of the game unless you have a homebrew modification to it. You just can't do it. Same for the insurgent side. They are also limited to the sort of tactics which guerrilla movements had at that period of the late 1950s and the early 1960s. So certain things which are now common parts of insurgency warfare are just not available to them as options. So it's based on a very clear and clever understanding of the frame and the mindset of the commanders on both sides as to what they were able to do at the time. And the game is built around that and imposes those limitations. On the purely political spectrum, this is one of the nicest ones that's come out in the past year, which is it models the Versailles Peace Conference of 1919, and this is a purely political game. There is no military dimension. There is the possibility for revolts in various parts of the world if things get messy, but otherwise there is no military dimension to it. It is all about the issues which arose during the peace conference. So each player has influence, which they can put on the issues, and at some point in time you can decide to settle an issue if you have the most influence on it. And there are options. This is Palestine. This is a real hard case, and was in 1919. And so the card presents you with the 4 historically possible options at the time. What could be done with it? And they have an impact on the different outcomes for the different players. So creating a Zionist state, whoops, that's fallen away there, for example, increases Britain's happiness by 1, but increases the possibility for unrest in the Middle East by 4. If you're a power that has interests in the Middle East, you're not going to be so keen on going for that option. The UK mandate, which was the historic outcome, is a bonus for British imperialism, that little Britain symbol with the globe, does increase, almost all of the options increase the possibility of unrest in the Middle East. So there is no good solution in this. Independence, for instance, makes Britain unhappy because they lose influence in the region, but it does improve overall the prospects for democracy in the world and the possibility and the prospects for the League of Nations and for self-determination and other things like that. And of course, it's worth a certain number of victory points to the player that successfully produces the resolution. If you are, for instance, the Italian player, and you have the option to resolve this issue, well, the Italians had no particular interest in the Middle East, but they had significant interest in the Balkans. So maybe they're going to resolve this not on the basis of what the impact on the Middle East is, but how they can trade off what choice they make here for a favorable outcome to an issue in the Balkans. So it's about spending your influence to get control of the right to make a decision about an issue, and then also how do you settle it so that it affects your interests. The other thing, of course, is that one of the key features of the negotiations were the personalities, and different people are represented as personalities, and when they come into play, when an issue is resolved, the issue moves off, the player that settled it gets it, then the personality in play is resolved. There may be an uprising, but of course, Nansen played a huge part in the post-World War I refugee settlement. And the player, therefore, that settles an issue and gets to play this card can recover some of their spent influence for every Bolshevik strategy token on a settled issue, because what Nansen did was he repatriated a lot of refugees and prisoners of war, mainly from what had been formerly Tsarist Russia and was now Russia in the grips of a civil war, and that increased, reduced the tension and resolved a problem for that region, which allows players therefore to recover influence on that. So it's a remarkably simple game to play. But what it does is the event cards model the actual historical events that were in play at the conference. The victory points that are available for them represent how important they were. The options represent what the actual historical possibilities were. And the object for each country is to try and maximize its score, get the maximum possible number of victory points, keep its happiness high, to try and win the game. There are variants on this game system. This whole sort of card-driven area control influence, placing influence. There's a whole bunch. There's one that models political decision-making in ancient Greece. There's one for the Congress of Vienna. There's one that models the conferences between the great powers in World War II, which are some of the sort of more notable ones. There are similar games, like, for instance, The Making of the President in 1960, which models how in the 1960 election, as the manager for one or the other presidential campaign, you spend money and influence in different regions and in different media markets, and conduct different campaigning operations in order to try and essentially swing states and gain control of the electoral college, which is very topical and interesting. And I could bring that up and talk about that for a long time, but I don't want to go on ad nauseum. And what I really want to make the point here is that, I mean, the advantage of these, a lot of these games have been or will be converted to digital. A lot of digital games that are successful um, see the production of a physical board game. So there's a heavy crossover. And the important thing for us in terms of designing games that can be used for learning, games that can be used for teaching and learning, and also for modeling and exploring possibilities, is that these games, the rules and the mechanics, expose your understanding of the system. You have to decide what's important, how these things interact with one another. How can the different parties, the different players in the game, what sort of options do they have for taking action? How can they exercise options? What do they have to spend? Money, influence, force, what are the resources available to them? Foreign aid, what is it that they can use, to achieve the result? You do have to make decisions in designing these to abstract out a whole load of things. You have to decide what the key things you're interested in, and you abstract the others and focus on the mechanics of the problem that you are most interested in, to see how you can then play this through. And of course, the advantage of this is that you can play these through again and again and again and explore the alternative possibilities. And a great many of the ones that I've shown you are all hobby games. There's a substantial crossover. A lot of the people who design these design high-level business and military war games and simulations. Quite a few of games that have been designed as popular hobby games have been taken up by the military, because they offer useful and well-designed models of particular problems which they can explore. They spend a lot of money on this. So it is one of the main game designers from the sort of civil hobby game side, who also worked in the military side, Jim Dunnigan, described these as paper computers, very presciently, before we had the sort of current level of computer power that we now have, which allows you to play a great many of these on mobile devices and explore the possibilities, and play them also against real human opponents on mobile devices or online. But the nuts and bolts issue here is, what is the problem that you are trying to understand? What are you trying to communicate? What is the scope of the problem? What are the key issues? And how do you represent them in a way that people can understand? So that's essentially the essence, and that's why design the simulationist school of game design, designing games on the basis that they are a simulation of a real world problem that allow you to explore and understand it. That is what is important. If you can do that well, then you can do planning well. You can also do game design well, of course. And you can make money out of it too.